The exhibit was the brainchild, you might say, of a committee who really wanted to honor the veterans who have served in the military throughout the Upper Peninsula over the years, but also those that are currently serving. So, you know, to take on a project of this magnitude, because it isn't just one skirmish or one war or one county, it's all of the Upper Peninsula. And so what we've done with the design in this exhibit is to lay out various walls where we can tell the story of the impact the Upper Peninsula has had on that particular war. So when we come in the first portion here, what we have is the Civil War. And you would think, well, what did the Upper Peninsula have to do with the Civil War, for heaven's sakes, because we were barely a state in 1837. In 1861, now we're dealing with a war that is a distance away, yet 1,209 young men left the Upper Peninsula for the Civil War and fought for the Union. And so on this display wall, we bring that out, but we also lost 247 men from the Upper Peninsula, and we want to honor them. So we have made that effort to incorporate that into the wall. The sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of the Civil War from the Upper Peninsula still is an organization that's operating today. It's called the Albert and James Lion. And so we have recognized both of them. Albert was killed in Georgia during the Civil War, but James came home even though he was wounded. And so he lived to be 102. He was the last Upper Peninsula Civil War veteran to pass away, so we'll recognize him as well. And we're very honored to have found a gentleman who was in the theater the night that President Lincoln was shot, was also from the Upper Peninsula. So these are the kinds of things that we will bring to the attention of people as they walk through this exhibit. On the other side, we have the Spanish-American War, and it was very similar. My reaction to the Civil War was the Spanish-American War because the war was only 10 weeks long, and what kind of impact did the Upper Peninsula have on that particular war? But very similar, like the Civil War, the impact was not only the men that served, but also the contribution of the Upper Peninsula to any war effort, and that was iron ore. And oh my gosh, the Civil War would have never been able to acquire the amount of iron ore out of the Upper Peninsula if the first Sioux Lock had not been finished in 1855 in time for that 1861 war. So the same with the Spanish-American War. Iron ore and copper were very, very important to that effort, but over 700 young men left the Upper Peninsula to fight in the Spanish-American War, but also the insurrection of the Philippines as well. And when we move down a little bit, you'll see this moves right into World War I. And of course, this was a whole different ball game for the United States because coming out of the Civil War was one thing, and having peace the amount of time that they did, and then going into this. Now, this president at this time really worked hard to keep the Americans out of war. And Europe had been fighting Germany for quite some time, but again, in 1917, we were really sucked right into this, and it's called the American Expeditionary Forces that fought in France and Belgium and Italy, and we're going to bring to attention that that war was fought in the trenches. And they had very little mechanized equipment. So some of the instruments that we have found to put in that display are very in tune to the World War I expeditionary forces. And something that people don't always realize is that so many horses, mules, and donkeys were used in that war because we didn't have tanks and bulldozers and jeeps as early as 1917. So over 8 million horses, donkeys, and mules died in that war. worldwide, and I think it's time to call attention to something like that too. And dogs were very important for the communications, because from trench to trench, a soldier was such a target where they could send a dog with the message and he was low to the ground, and so it's a whole different way of thinking today in our war effort. But so I wanted to call attention to that as well. The Signal Corps was really very prevalent in World War I. Coming out of the Civil War, all they had for communication were mirrors and flags. And coming into the World War I, the Signal Corps became very important with communication. So we will identify that as well. We also have a complete list of all of the veterans, the soldiers that died during World War I in various places, and we will have a full listing of those troops, and we certainly want to honor them with this wall as well. It moves us then right into World War II, and this whole wall will be World War II. And my thoughts is, how in the world do you transition into World War II with such a short distance from the time frame? When they came out of World War I, you went straight into the Roaring '20s, and people thought prosperity would last forever. Well, not necessarily the case when World War I cost this nation $32 billion. And something else that was a pretty high percentage at that time was prohibition, because $11 billion in tax revenue was lost to the nation because of prohibition. So when we moved into an era where the banks began to fail, the government did not have the resources to shore them up. And so when the banks began to close and people did not have access to their money, we moved into the greatest depression of the century. And in 1933 is when President Roosevelt came into office, and he said this country needs to be fed and put back to work. And that's exactly what he did. And the impact on the Upper Peninsula from the Roosevelt New Deal is the fact that the CCC camps, there were 45 of them in the Upper Peninsula, that put a lot of men back to work. And the other thing was the WPA, and Workers' Progress Association, and that's where so many of the local buildings were built during that time frame. So once the country was back on an even keel, or feeling as if they were back on an even keel, then Europe again was in war. Roosevelt knew this. He was very, very savvy, and he knew that this country needed to be prepared for war, even though it was the last thing that we wanted. In March of 1941, President Roosevelt established a military district in Sault Ste. Marie. Now, who would think? The Japanese did not bomb Pearl Harbor until December 7th of 1941. But in March, the president established this military district. Why? Because of the protection of the Sioux Locks. And I don't believe I could emphasize enough what that means to the nation, because in World War II, 300 million tons of iron ore came through the Sioux Locks. That equated to 380 million tons of steel to build everything that was made available: airplanes, tanks, jeeps, and amphibious vehicles that were then available for that war effort. So there was so much to the military district of Sault Ste. Marie. Now, on to my left here, you see a kiosk that is now finally in place, and this also will be World War I. And this is quite a unique feature, because this will feature the polar bears. The war of World War I was done on November 11th, 1918. But these troops were trained the summer of 1918 and sent to Europe, expecting to go to France. And yet they were sent 600 miles north of Moscow to fight in a civil war, in the Russian Civil War. They were called the polar bears. And the temperatures ranged at 50 below zero. They didn't have adequate clothing and food and supplies, but they took what they had and they fought all through that winter. When the war was done on November 11th, they were still fighting clear into January of 1919. We have over 100 men were from the Upper Peninsula. So we have a full list of those 100 men that we will recognize on this kiosk for their efforts in fighting as the polar bears in World War I, of all things. They did not, the Upper Peninsula troops did not get home until July of 1919. So back to the World War II wall, you know, we had a lot of things that went on. As I mentioned, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we lost 11 men in Pearl Harbor from the Upper Peninsula. We will honor those 11 and list them on this wall. In the military district, which was most interesting in Sault Ste. Marie, because how do you begin to protect the Sioux locks? And they did it with barrage balloons. They were 30 feet long, filled with hydrogen on 2,000-foot, 1-inch cables, and they placed them all over the Sioux locks for any dive bombing planes that might be coming in. And there were a lot of other efforts that took place there at that time, and a lot of volunteers as well. But Fort Brady in Sault Ste. Marie housed about 600 men in 1938. And in 1942, there were 8,000. So Sault Ste. Marie really stepped up to house and feed this number of people during that war effort. And once they felt the community was somewhat safe, then they withdrew those troops to be able to go overseas. But during that same time frame, the Macarthur Lock was designated, commissioned at that time, and it's an amazing story because the Macarthur Lock was built in 10 months. Through the winter months of all things, they brought in heaters. 1,000 men worked on the Macarthur Lock during World War II. And something else that is very amazing to me as you do the research is that you stop and think, where do our pilots train to take off and land on aircraft carriers if the Atlantic is under so much stress from the Germans and the Pacific is under stress from the Japanese? Where do you train these pilots? Well, it was done right here on Lake Michigan. 2 cruise ships were completely converted to aircraft carriers, and 18,000 pilots trained on Lake Michigan, including First President George H.W. Bush. So I think that is an amazing contribution from the Upper Peninsula and the state of Michigan to the war effort. And there was a lighthouse right at the Straits of Mackinac that was used as a target for 2,000-pound bombs, which is an amazing effort as well. We have a gentleman from the Upper Peninsula who was a designer of aircraft, and he earned his way into a tremendous position with his design efforts. And he went to work for Lockheed, and Lockheed furnished a tremendous amount of designed aircrafts for World War II and beyond. And most of his aircraft are featured in a National Geographic magazine from 1943, and we will also recognize him. The 107th Division of the National Guard is based here in the Upper Peninsula in Ishpeming, with areas all across the Upper Peninsula with a number of different National Guard troops, and they were very prevalent also during all wars, but during World War II, they built a bridge some 1,300 feet long over the Rhine River in 14 hours, and we hope to feature them as well. Then we're going to move into civil defense, because so much of the efforts are volunteer efforts, and that's where they came into civil defense. Everything from airplane spotters to fallout shelters. It was very active, right down to children. And if you think about what did the children's impact have during the war, but they were responsible for a lot of scrap drives, because there was nothing wasted during World War II. They collected scrap, and by the pound brought it to school. And something else is that you stop and think of life vests and what they're made of. And kapok, the floss from the kapok tree, and is what was used. But the kapok trees were under the Japanese rule, and so something else needed to be collected in order to make these life vests. Well, so they found that milkweed and the floss from the seed of the milkweed pod, and so children actually collected. The government sent bags to the schools, and they would take the bags and collect milkweed pods all along the railroad tracks and rural roads. It was an amazing time. This area will be a display area for a lot of World War II items, and right now we're still in the building phases, but that's what it will be for. This wall right here is going to recognize Native Americans in their military efforts, and there are so many that it's very difficult to get their story down to one wall. But one thing that really stands out for me is Company K. And we go back to the Civil War, and Michigan initiated sharpshooters, and there were 140 sharpshooters, all from Michigan, who were all Native Americans. And 9 of them were from the Upper Peninsula. We will bring recognition to those 9, but 2 of them died in Andersonville, which was seriously tragic. So we want to make sure that we recognize our Native Americans and the impact and the input that they've had into the war effort of the Upper Peninsula. This I'm calling the industrial wall because of the fact that no new cars were built during World War II, and all businesses, all industries were converted to the war effort. And so you stop and think of, well, what kind of Upper Peninsula businesses would have been converted at that time? And of course, the Ford Motor Company had a lot of interest in the Upper Peninsula. They made all their wooden parts up here in Iron Mountain in Kingsford. And the Kingsford plant was completely converted to the war effort during World War II, and they made gliders. 4,700 gliders were made here in the Upper Peninsula. And they produced the most gliders of any other company nationwide. But the fuselage, the internal bodyworks of the glider, were welded. It was tubing that was welded in Menominee at Lloyd Manufacturing. And Lloyd Manufacturing is famous for their outdoor furniture, their wicker blend of furniture. But during the war effort, the conversion took place, and most of the welders were young women from the Menominee and Marinette area. And I do have a feature story on a lady who did weld there at Lloyd Manufacturing for the gliders that were coming out of Iron Mountain. Marinette Marine and the Liberty ships that were built there during the war is also an industry that was converted to war effort. And we had a sportswear company in Iron Mountain that produced 20,000 Army field uniforms during the war, as well as Marquette Prison made Navy and Army uniforms. As hard as this is, we all know that there are horrors and atrocities of war. It's not something we want to see or have to talk about, but it's the truth. And we had so many during World War II prisoners of war. 24 from the Upper Peninsula died in prisoner of war camps, and we want to honor those 24 men. We have their names. We will list them on here. Some of the worst battles of World War II, of course, was the Battle of the Bulge, but the Bataan Death March was such an atrocity. And again, this is where a lot of this happened. So we will use this wall for that purpose. And we move over here, and this is Korea. And Korea, like Vietnam, has always been kind of attributed to as a forgotten war, but certainly we do not want to forget. On this wall, the Upper Peninsula lost 93 men in Korea, and we will make sure that their names are listed here and that we will recognize and honor our Korean veterans. I am looking for a Jeep. I really want a Jeep from 1940s, 1950s, because they used the same Jeep World War II, Korea, and into Vietnam. And that Jeep will be right here, and I hope that youngsters can sit in that Jeep and they can get their picture taken, and I want them to feel a part of this. And so that is the plan in the Korean exhibit. And next, of course, is Vietnam. This is not always easy because it's still very, very prevalent today. We lost 115 Upper Peninsula men in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and we will recognize them with some type of an interpretation of the Vietnam Wall. But we have a beautiful portrait that will go up on the wall of Vietnam and those soldiers in the rice paddies. And I think there's a message here, you know, these men were prepared to serve and they were prepared to die, but they were not prepared to be forgotten. And we want to remember these men and women that fought in Vietnam. Display cases. We have 5 very beautiful, 6 actually coming up, display cases that we will put smaller exhibits in, and we're very pleased that we've had the kind of effort of volunteers to put a lot of this together, so we're really proud of that. When we come around this corner, this wall will be the Twin Towers. And of course, how can any of us forget 9/11? And the Twin Tower will be here and on fire. And an insert either on this wall or with it immediately will be of the Pentagon. Why? Because we lost Lieutenant Colonel Kip Taylor from Marquette in the Pentagon on 9/11. We will honor him. This wall right here will be those that we've lost since 9/11. And we will list their names and their hometowns. And the sad part about this is that we will leave room for more because this war is never ending. And the important thing of this entire exhibit is to recognize those who have served, those who are currently serving, and honor them. Their duty was to serve, but our duty is to remember. And I think there's nothing more important to this exhibit than something like that. This wall is very hard for me to do, but we will. And there is something about every war and skirmish from the dawn of time that if you were to capture a hill or a trench or whatever, you captured their flag. Usually they signed their flag. It was a war trophy that they brought home, and we're calling it the Trophies of War. And I had a very difficult time putting this up. I really did. But if you look closely, it's signed by all of the troops who captured that flag. And the gentleman that brought it home It was the only one that survived. That is a very important memento of war. And we have other things, swords and you name it, that will be a part of this. When we move over to this section, I've developed a kitchen from World War II. And part of the reason for this is that we know there was tremendous sacrifice on the battlefield, but there was tremendous sacrifice at home too. Everything was rationed. Gasoline was rationed, tires were rationed, speed limit was 35 miles an hour in order to conserve. Sugar, barely could you get sugar, like a half a pound per family in a time frame. You had coupon books, rationing books that you had to apply for, and there would be small stamps in there that you take to the grocery store in order to get coffee. 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks for a family. So you'll also notice, as colorful as it is, the curtains, the quilt top, are all made from flour sack material, because the millers got pretty smart when the women were using the muslin flour sack bags to make their curtains and aprons and dresses for their children, that they started to print them. And that's what you will see up here. These are all authentic flour sack bags that this was made of. And it's also interesting that you'll see the oatmeal on the table, and the dishes came inside the oatmeal. And so when you bought your 3 pounds of oats, well, then you could plan on finding a cup and saucer. And it's very different today, but this was some of the sacrifice at home with limited communication. If you lost a loved one, it usually came by telegram. And a lot of times that telegram did not come for a great period of time. You'll notice in the window, she has a blue star hanging in the window. That means that her husband or loved one is serving in the military. If that star were to turn to red, that means that soldier is missing in action. And if that star were turned to gold, that means she had lost him. Now, there was a book that was written called Ordinary Heroes, 6 Stars in the Window. And it's a family from Ishpeming who sent 6 sons to the war effort. We will feature that book, but finding in the research there were over 100 families from the Upper Peninsula who sent 4 or more children to war. That's astounding from an area as small as this in population, but our contributions are great. We'll move over here a little bit. I'm going to portray the Fly Girls. This is a very fascinating story to me. During World War II, the Air Force said, our pilots are needed overseas for missions. We need women pilots to transport goods and services nationwide. And that's 1,700 women with pilot license and hours in responded to that call. 38 of them were from Michigan. 4 were from the Upper Peninsula. And one of the 4 was a squadron commander. Again, we want to tell their story because of the fact that they didn't move just supplies. They also test flew every aircraft coming out of the factory. And they were tow target pilots. In other words, they piloted the plane that towed the banner behind that the troops on the ground could shoot at with live ammunition. Those are tow targets. And when they finished their service at the end of the war and came home, they found that they were not military. No honorable discharge, no benefits. And they fought for 60 years to get that recognition, and they finally did. And President Obama signed that legislation. Most of them were gone. This is one of my favorite stories. This is, again, a huge impact in what is the contribution from the Upper Peninsula. But When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, within that next month, they took over the islands in the Pacific, especially the Philippines. And when they went into Manila, they rounded up 2,000 civilians and put them in an internment camp for 3 years. And of those 2,000 civilians, 55 of them were Catholic nuns from the convent in New York. And 2 of those nuns were from the Upper Peninsula. They survived that 3 years in internment. And the rescue of those civilians was profound. Colin Powell said that was a textbook rescue, one that every branch of the military could learn from. The Los Banos rescue on the 23rd of February, 1945, the amphibious vehicles landed right at the right time as the paratroopers landed right at the right time, and the guerrillas from the Philippines came in also. They took out those guards and rescued 2,000 people. Most of them didn't weigh over 100 pounds. 123 of them couldn't walk. And yet they were able to get them out behind enemy lines. This is an amazing story. But it's so overlooked in history because it's the same day that they put up the flag at Iwo Jima. And so it was so overshadowed. But that's one of the stories that we hope that this exhibit will be able to tell. And then come around this corner, and I am really excited about this piece. This came out of Detroit, but it is the exact type of World War I switchboard that would have been used in France and Belgium on the front lines. And a poster very similar to this will go up. This will portray what we call the Hello Girls. There's a beautiful documentary about the Hello Girls that is out, and we have permission to use, and we hope to make that available right alongside this. But General Pershing in 1917, who was the commander for World War I, put out the call for bilingual switchboard operators, and 223 young women from the United States went to France and Belgium. They were on the front line. They transferred 26 million calls, interpreted, intercepted, and transferred 26 million calls. And Pershing's response to this was that they helped to win the war. They were on the front lines. Their chairs looked just like this with a hard hat and a gas mask. And the pictures that portray them in that mode are still available. We will make sure that that picture is up on the wall as well. The same thing with the Flag Girls. When these young women got home, they were Army, they were Signal Corps, they took the oath of office, they wore uniform, they were under the same regulation of every other Army recruit, but when they got home, they found that they were not military. And it was President Carter, how many years, 1979, after the war was done, in 1918, that finally brought recognition and gave an honorable discharge to the Hello Girls that served in World War I. So with that brings us around this corner where we will have a display case, and we will display the uniforms of each branch of the military, and we're very excited to do that. We're keeping our displays to a minimum so that it doesn't look overwhelming. And that will be on this wall. And over here, every year, the Upper Peninsula State Fair recognizes a Veteran of the Year. This wall will be dedicated to the UP State Fair Veteran of the Year, and all of those who have been recognized will be on this wall, but also those yet to come. And we're excited about this area of this new exhibit because the Upper Peninsula Honor Flight started right here in Delta County. Barb Van Roy did a magnificent job with her committee of setting up tours for veterans to have an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. and see their monuments, starting with World War II. And since then, Korean veterans have gone, and now Vietnam veterans are going. There's 17 flights that have taken place thus far. How many more? It's hard to say. Could be 2, could be 22. But regardless, we wanted a place for a legacy exhibit for the honor flight. And it represents veterans from all across the Upper Peninsula, and this whole area will be dedicated to a legacy for the honor flight for the Upper Peninsula. So with that, that is a brief walkthrough of what our expectations are for this exhibit. It will be a permanent exhibit, and when people come to Delta County and stop to find resources all across the peninsula to visit, we hope to capture their attention just a little bit longer by bringing them through the Webster Marble Inventing the Outdoors exhibit and the Upper Peninsula Military exhibit as well.